Hello, I'm Sonya Nevin. In the voice of the young Brontes, Antiquity and social comment in the Bronte Juvenilia, I'm going to talk a little about the Brontes as child writers and about their use of the ancient Greco-Roman world in their writing. Their Juvenilia refers to the work that they wrote from childhood until around 20. Charlotte, Emily, and Anne Bronte would go on to be famous novelists, the authors of Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and more. They also had a talented brother, Branwell, though his chaotic adult life prevented him from achieving the success of his sisters. These four Bronte children were born in England in the late Georgian era, between 1816 and 1820. The girls and their two older sisters went briefly to boarding school, but when the two eldest died, they were brought home and educated there. There would be spells at a different school years later, but mostly they were learning at home, reading their father's books, journals, and periodicals. The children's world changed one afternoon when Charlotte Bronte was 10, when their father arrived home with a box of toy soldiers for Branwell. The toys inspired an outburst of creative writing in which the soldiers were the daring protagonists. With their usual precociousness, the Bronte children depicted themselves as godlike genii controlling the toys' universe. They created a fictional world for the toy soldiers that would dominate their imaginative play and writing even into adulthood. They wrote stories, histories, and plays in tiny books, handwritten and hand-stitched. It was a creative apprenticeship that would inform their groundbreaking adult work. The survival of much of their juvenile writing offers us insight into a child and teen's perspective on the 1820s and 30s. Likewise, it offers us insight into how these children perceived antiquity and how they drew on it to articulate their developing sense of the world. The fictional world that the Bronte children created was based on the real-world southern coast of West Africa. The toy soldiers were known as the Twelves. They had settled West Africa and established the Glasstown Federation, with a capital, Glasstown, at the mouth of the River Niger. We can see a map drawn by Branwell, and here it is in a more diagrammatic form by Bronte scholar Christine Alexander. And here for reference, a modern map of the same region. The Glasstown Federation covered from around Sierra Leone east towards Nigeria and Cameroon. Around 5 years into the writing of the saga, a new kingdom called Angria was established following a war. Angria covered much of Cameroon, and that's where most of the action was focused from then on. A senior member of the Twelves was a fictionalized version of real-life general Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington. The central figure of the Angria saga, as it came to be known, was Wellington's son, another Arthur Wellesley. Like the Duke's real-life son, Arthur Jr. was styled the Marquis of Douro. Here he is depicted by Charlotte. In time, he became the Duke of Zamorna. Here he is as an older man, drawn by Branwell. Zamorna is a profoundly Byronic figure, charismatic, intelligent, troubled. The saga is a riot of his marriages, mistresses, adventures and wars, and his inexorable rise to greater and greater political power. His main rival and sometimes friend and father-in-law is Lord Elrington, Duke of Northumberland, who was loosely based on Napoleon. One of Northumberland's wives is Zamorna's friend, the beauty and scholar Zenobia Elrington. So now you know the setup, let's have a look at some of the detail. The earliest classical features which appear are Greek and Roman names. In a play of 1829, we find the characters Marcellus Fitzroy, Scipio Africanus Clarkson, and Socrates Rystalk. Charlotte has been raiding Lempriere's classical dictionary for naming inspiration. In this instance, the allusions have no impact on characterization or plot. They seem rather to be decorative and playful, perhaps more indicative of an attraction to the exoticness of classical names rather than for any particular narrative purpose. But it already shows an interest in classical features and in time such inclusions would be carried out with much greater deliberation. The following year, the great glass town was renamed Verdopolis. That was then shortened to the easier to pronounce Verdopolis. One of the narrators of the saga, Arthur's younger brother Charles, explains that the new name is a compound of a Greek and a French word, combined to mean the same thing as the original. The classicizing of the name reflects the increasing classicizing of the environment. These children have read about colonial environments. They know how important neoclassical architecture was to the colonial ventures in India, Australia, the Americas, and elsewhere, and they have their characters replicate that in their settling of West Africa. One of the great rivers is dubbed the Olympia River. Verdopolis is increasingly described in neoclassical terms, with columns, stowers, and classical temple-style buildings aplenty. We see this even more in Arthur's new city. He becomes king of Angria, then restyles himself as Emperor Adrian the Magnificent. He builds a new capital for Angria, naming it Adrianopolis after himself in the style of many a Greek or Roman monarch. In the two cities, we find districts named after the Muses. A city gate, a common rendezvous point, is called the Gate of Hades. We find a gentleman's club named Elysium, its name taken from the home of the blessed dead in Greek mythology, imitating something that the children had read in Blackwood's magazine. Likewise, the atmosphere of a high-class gambling den is conveyed through description of its neoclassical architecture. The walls are, to quote, entirely built of highly polished grey marble, as was the roof, supported by fluted pillars of the same, crowned with Corinthian capitals. The description of classical features creates an impression of elitism with additional connotations of luxury and perhaps of decadence. Classical architecture is a sign of the Europeanization of the environment and of technical skill, but not always of moral goodness. We begin to find this contributing to the characterization of key figures. Arthur, Duke of Zamorna, becomes increasingly despotic as the saga goes on. His brother notes all of this bitterly. For him, his brother's character change is manifest in his increasing preference for Corinthian columns over Doric ones. Once he was content with restrained elegance, now he is set on gorgeous luxury. The architecture of his new palace, he notes, shows well how the lord of both has changed and risen. Charles augments his architectural observation with literature, complaining of his brother, once he was a man of taste, learning, genius, science, at once the Homer and Maecenas of his age, that is, poet and patron. Now, but I will not waste time and temper by writing what he now is. We hear in this the character change in Arthur, and we can also see in it characterization of his brother Charles. Charles was one of the major narrators of the saga, one of the characters that Charlotte writes as. As the son of the Duke of Wellington, Charles is aristocratic, well-educated, thoroughly grounded in the classical world. He is bookish and sarcastic. When he writes about people, he compares them to this god or goddess, or that philosopher or poet, or he says how far short of those classical ideals they have fallen. He writes poetry in which he complains about having so much Latin to learn when he would rather go out and play. But not all the narrators in the saga are like this. Charlotte would also write as the narrator and character Captain Tree. Captain Tree is a bluff old soldier, and you will never find him uttering a classical allusion. You'll never see him comparing someone to Hercules or commenting on classical architecture. It's just not part of his worldview. We can see here that the young Brontes were not only imitating others and forming their own classical frames of reference to talk about people and society, they also had the awareness to recognize the class distinction that this represented. They were very good at creating the voices of different characters and narrators, and they knew that part of that was being selective about who could or could not express themselves through a classical frame of reference. This aspect of classical culture also has relevance in the colonial narrative of Angria. The European or European-descended wealthy male inhabitants of the Glasstown Federation not only built a neoclassical environment for themselves in Africa, they also use classical reference in their political lives. It informs the structure of their society. It informs their political speeches and debates. It is not typically part of the language of the displaced Africans. The Bronte children flattened the cultural complexity of the region and made all the Africans of the area members of the Ashanti people. The real Ashanti are centered around southern modern Ghana. In the Brontes' day, the Ashanti had a long history as gold and slave traders, supplying Arabia with its slave population before branching out into trade with Europeans. They were familiar to the Brontes due to the widely reported Ashanti Wars of the 1820s, in which the Ashanti fought the British partly over land and partly over their intention to keep trading slaves after the slave trade was outlawed within the British Empire in 1807. There's no getting away from it. There are racist aspects to the Brontes' depiction of the Ashanti. Perhaps that's not surprising in a work that is by its nature colonialist and which refers to colonialist material that the teenage Brontes were reading. When Branwell Bronte describes thousands of Ashanti warriors being defeated by the 12s, he draws on dehumanizing tropes. As I've argued in my book on the Battle of Marathon, Branwell subtly turns ancient history on its head by comparing an early battle of conquest in Africa to the Battle of Marathon, with the invading 12s in the role of the defending Greeks. Charlotte similarly uses racist tropes in characterizing key Ashanti figures through their treachery and unmanaged emotions. But of course, it is much more complicated than that. There is, for example, no slavery or slave trade in the Glasstown Federation. And although there is great adventure to be had in depicting wars between the Ashanti and the Angrians, Charlotte in particular shows sympathy with their situation. While the Brontes favour the old king who made peace with the Europeans, they are also able to represent the point of view of his son and grandson who chose to fight back. When the son is killed, his wife's response is depicted in a sympathetic work called The African Queen's Lament. In it, the dignified queen likens the Ashanti to the Jews' captivity at Babylon, depressed yet awaiting justice and rightful restoration. Classical education has a role in all of this. The Duke of Wellington becomes the adoptive father of Ashanti Prince Kwashia Kwamina. As Arthur and Charles's adoptive brother, he shares their education and is just as capable as them at learning. The Europeans might bring classical culture to Africa, but it is not inherently European, and the Africans are shown to be just as capable of mastering it when the opportunity is there. Prince Kwashia later betrays the family and joins their enemies. It is implied that his education has not saved him from his own nature. But then the same is equally true of Arthur. The African Olympic Games are celebrated in the Glasstown Federation long before the Olympics were relaunched in the real world. And in poem and speech again and again, we hear the sentiment that Europe is over and the future is in neoclassical Africa. The Brontes' father was deeply involved in missionary work in Africa. He had come of age amidst the abolitionist scene in Cambridge and was involved in educating missionaries. He believed in the power of education to transform lives, and he included Africans in that as much as anyone else. We see some of these ideas reflected in the saga. There is colonialist arrogance here, but there is also a theoretical belief in equality. Prince Kwashia is not an entirely likable character, but his intelligence and equal response to education is indicative of a sincerely held sense of Africa's potential. At much greater length, Charlotte explored sex difference in education. Wealthy boys and young men study the classics, read a lot of Virgil and Sophocles, and they go on to Angria's Academy of Modern Athenians. The women of their class have no such opportunities. They learn modern languages, accomplishments, that's it. Through this gendered division, the men of Glasstown perpetuate their monopoly on learning and on their ability to participate in public life. The exception is Zenobia. Zenobia's charisma, intellect, and noble birth earn her a prominent place in Angrian society. Her physical appearance is striking, all crimson velvets and plumed turbans. But she is distinguished just as much by her classical learning, fluent in Latin, Greek, Persian, and more. Zenobia's character was inspired by the historical Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, who had featured so memorably in Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbon's Zenobia is beautiful, learned, and politically active, and she clearly made an impression on the young Charlotte Bronte, who incorporated these aspects into her Zenobia. Charlotte's recreation of Zenobia demonstrates the enduring impact that a positive representation of a capable woman from an antiquity could have. Zenobia's mastery of classical languages distinguishes her from the other women in Angrian society. Her knowledge is a source of strength and independence to her, saving her from the chronic boredom that afflicted so many women of the same leisured class, both real and fictional. Captain Tree describes her, for example, sitting alone in her boudoir with her eyes fixed on a Greek copy of Aeschylus's tragedies. The ability and inclination to read Greek literature provides Zenobia with a stimulating occupation that forms an attractive comparison to the vacuous hours spent by her counterparts. Nonetheless, the ambiguous nature of Zenobia's volatile character and the mixed responses that others have to her signal the difficulty Charlotte had conceiving a classically educated woman in entirely positive terms. When Zenobia is first introduced to the saga, she longs to marry Arthur. The will they won't they drags on, but ultimately they won't, because Arthur isn't interested in having an educated wife. Similarly, Arthur's brother, the narrator Charles, is torn between his admiration and his contempt for Zenobia. A mere blue, that is, a blue-stocking and educated woman, ought not to be so handsome, he complains. Zenobia is referred to as nature's mistake and as a masculine soul in a female casket. Men dwell on Zenobia's supposed masculinity, attempting to solve the puzzle of her classical learning and rob her of her complexity. Charlotte could conceive of a classically educated woman, but she could not do so without reflecting the usual negative stereotypes and exploring social risk. In her depiction of the women of Angria, Charlotte demonstrates an anxiety about education in which knowledge of ancient culture is as much a social risk as it is a source of empowerment. One of the women who Arthur does marry is well read in French and Italian, plays the harp, but makes no claims to classical learning. Moreover, this woman, Mary, knows more than she lets on. She never refers to the ancient world in front of Arthur, but she does do it in letters to women of her acquaintance. Mary's selective use of classical terms suggests her reluctance to be judged by male society for having masculine attainments. That this was a deliberate construction on Charlotte's part is confirmed in a rare moment of harmony between husband and wife. Mary chats to Arthur about domestic affairs, and the narrator observes, "The fact was, she could have spoken with much more depth and sense. She could have rounded her periods like a blue if she had had a mind, and discussed topics worthy of a member of Parliament. But this suited her better. Art was at the bottom of it after all. It answered." Domestic harmony is achieved by Mary's feigned ignorance. Arthur may like his friends to be educated, but he prefers the ignorance he associates with innocence in his lovers. On the one occasion that a rattled Mary lets a classical reference slip in front of a male character, that man then wonders if, under what he calls her sweet, gentle semblance, Mary really has the passion of a murderer. Education for women in Angria is ambiguous, a source of personal empowerment and a social liability. You will find entries discussing some of the Bronte Juvenilia in the Our Mythical Childhood database of Antiquity in young people's culture. You can read more of the Juvenilia itself, mostly through editions carefully produced by Christine Alexander. I hope I have given you a taste today of the manner in which the Bronte Juvenilia offers us an insight into a teenage perspective on the world in the 1820s and 30s. In particular, we have seen how their growing familiarity with classical texts and classical allusion enabled them to express their own thoughts on education, colonialism, class, and the situation of women in a male-dominated society. Thank you.